Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I'm Eric, and we're here to talk about some unconventional ways to build your commander deck. So let's talk about the Kaldheim gods. Esika, god of the tree, is a mana dork in the command zone. This is a 3-mana 1/4 god that costs 1 green. It has vigilance, and it taps to add 1 mana of any color, and it gives all of your legendary creatures you control vigilance, as well as tap to add 1 mana of any color. And of course, Esika is one of those MDFC commanders from Kaldheim, and the reverse side of this card is a legendary enchantment called the Prismatic Bridge. This card art is loaded with enough rainbow auroras to make you vomit unicorns. Look at this nonsense. Look at it. Anyways, this legendary enchantment costs Wooburg, and it has, at the beginning of your upkeep, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card or a planeswalker card. Put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So, yep, free stuff each turn, cheating mana costs, it's good. We all know the Prismatic Bridge is good. Build it with planeswalkers or gods or whatever you like. Get your top deck manipulation and go have fun. But that's boring, so we're not going to be talking about the Prismatic Bridge anymore for the rest of this video. Instead, we are building a legendary tribal around Esika, god of the tree. Now, be ready, because when you reveal the Prismatic Bridge in your command zone, your opponents will be ready to team up against you, unless someone else is playing an even scarier commander like Korvold or Thrasios. So I would make it a priority to cast Esika as soon as possible. This will put them all at ease and decrease your threat level significantly, at least for a little while. So we're going to focus on 3 strategies that Esika enables. First, obviously, legendary matters. Esika specifically gives your legendary creatures vigilance and lets them tap to produce mana of any color, so we'll want to play with as many legendary creatures and as many legendary synergies as we can fit into this deck. Second, we have strong mana ramp and mana fixing from our commander. When Esika is in play, all of our creatures become mana dorks that produce mana of any color, so we'll be able to get away with playing spells with a lot of colored mana pips or X-mana spells. And third, vigilance matters. It's easy to overlook the fact that Esika gives all of our legendary creatures vigilance. There are some subtle things and some not so subtle things that we can do to take advantage of this, so we'll discuss those as well. And that's pretty much it. The premise of this deck is pretty simple. Play legendary things, make mana, get vigilance, win the game. Let's talk about what's in this deck and how we're going to win. Now, Esika is not the only card in the deck that cares about legendary permanents and legendary spells. There are plenty of other legendary matters cards that we can pick from, and since we're playing in all 5 colors, we can select the best of them for this deck. Kethis the Hidden Hand is an obvious fit for this deck. He reduces the cost of your legendary spells, it lets you cast legendary cards from your graveyard. We've got 29 creatures in this deck, and every single one of them is legendary. We've also got 5 non-creature legendaries in this deck, and Kethis helps us with them as well. I mean, this is such an obvious synergy that I don't really feel the need to discuss it any further. There's a couple of legendary creatures that help us draw cards in Reki, History of Kamigawa, and Joyra, Weatherlight Captain. Reki is a 1/2 that costs 2 and a green, and he says whenever you play a legendary spell, draw a card. And then Joyra is a 2/2 that costs 2 red-blue. She has whenever you cast a historic spell, draw a card. So, in addition to our 34 legendary spells in this deck, we have 5 non-legendary artifacts that will also let us draw cards off of Joyra. Again, I don't feel like I need to defend the addition of these 2 cards in this deck. They are quite obvious. Let's talk about something a little less obvious. Niambi, Esteemed Speaker, is a 2/1 that costs white-blue. She has flash, and when she enters the battlefield, you may return another creature you control to its owner's hand, and if you do, you gain life equal to that creature's converted mana cost. So she can help protect a creature from targeted removal by bouncing it back to your hand, or just let you cast a creature again to trigger its enter the battlefield effects again, though we don't really have too many enter the battlefield effects in this deck. Now, Niambi also lets you pay 1 white-blue and tap her and discard a legendary card to draw 2 cards. So you can toss creatures you don't need to help you find what you do need. And we've got a few pieces of recursion in this deck, like Kethis that we just talked about, to help us get those discarded cards back if we need them. Of course, the most legendary matters-est of all cards has to be Sisay Weatherlight Captain. That's right, we've got 2 Weatherlight Captains in the same deck, in Joyra and Sisay. I'm not sure how they feel about that, but I'm pretty sure a ship can only have 1 captain, so that's going to be a little bit awkward. Anyways, Sisay is a 2/2 that gets +1/+1 for each color among other legendary permanents you control, so she can be as large as 7/7. And she lets you pay Wooburg to search your library for a legendary permanent with CMC less than her power and put it onto the battlefield. Now, most of this deck's powerhouse cards that act as win conditions are legendary, so Sisay will help us find any of them. You could also play the old Sisay, just Captain Sisay. She can tap to let you search your library for a legendary card and put it into your hand. I'm not as excited about this one because we don't have too many ways to grant her haste in this deck, and she has to tap to find that legendary card, so you can't use her the turn she comes into play. But the ability is still really strong, so we do want to include it in the deck. Finally, we've got Kamal's Druidic Vow. This is silly. This is a legendary sorcery that costs X green. Now, legendary sorceries can only be cast if you control a legendary creature or planeswalker. Typically, this won't be an issue for us, but keep in mind you probably won't be able to cast it right after a board wipe or something like that. But anyways, Kamal's Druidic Vow lets you look at the top X cards of your library and put any number of lands and or legendary permanents with CMC X or less from among them onto the battlefield. This is sort of like Rise of the Dark Realms or Finale of Devastation, though again without the haste. Now, this deck doesn't typically generate infinite mana, but it can generate a lot of mana, and Kamal's Druidic Vow with a large X value will usually generate a game-winning amount of value for you, provided whatever you find with it survives until your next untap step. Now, there's other legendary creatures in our deck that help out with our legendary synergies, and you can see them in the deck list. The link is in the description. But remember, Esika also gives our legendary creatures vigilance. Let's talk about how we can take advantage of that. Now, Wizards has been printing a few keyword matters cards recently, like Hooded Blightfang for Death Touch and Labyrinth Raptor for Menace. Now, Vigilance has a few synergy cards as well. Keensight Mentor, Alert Heedbonder, Franland Felidar, for example. Keensight Mentor is a 3-mana 1/4 that puts a Vigilance counter on a non-human creature you control when it enters the battlefield, and you can also pay 1 and a white and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control that has Vigilance. Alert Heedbonder is another 3-mana. It's a 2/4 with Vigilance that gains you 1 life at the end of your turn for each creature you control that has Vigilance. Now, although they sound good because all of our creatures can have Vigilance, these two are fairly underwhelming in our deck. First, they're not legendary, so they're going to dilute our legendary matters focus. The +1/+1 counters from Keensight Mentor could be useful, but since it needs to tap to activate the ability, it's hard to break it. I haven't included either of these in this deck, but if you really like them, you will get a little bit of synergy out of them. Franland Felidar is, I think, almost good enough to be playable here. This is a 4-mana 3/5 that has Vigilance, and it gives creatures you control with Vigilance, pay 1 and tap to tap target creature. This lets our little legendary creatures tap down blockers to let our big ones get in for combat damage. And it lets us tap down possible attackers to protect ourselves. This is kind of like Glare of Subdual, an enchantment with exactly the same mana cost that lets you tap an untapped creature you control to tap target artifact or creature. But wait, you might be thinking. Glare of Subdual is actually better than Franland Felidar, since it's harder to remove because it's an enchantment. It doesn't cost us mana to tap things, we can use any creature to activate it, not just creatures with Vigilance, and it can tap artifacts as well as creatures. Okay, so I guess Vigilance Tribal still has a long ways to go. So I would recommend Glare of Subdual in this deck before you ever consider Franland Felidar. But if we dig a little bit deeper, there are other and perhaps stronger ways that we can take advantage of Vigilance. Storage Matrix is perhaps one of the best examples. This is a 3-mana artifact. It has, as long as Storage Matrix is untapped, each player chooses artifact, creature, or land during their untap step. That player can only untap permanents of this chosen type during this untap step. So typically with a card like Storage Matrix, we would use effects that allow us to tap it right before our untap step so that all of our permanents untap, and then we'd leave Storage Matrix untapped during our opponent's untap steps so that they could only untap their lands, creatures, or artifacts. And that's just mean, so we're not relying on any of that here. Instead, we're relying on the simple fact that our creatures will often have vigilance, so they won't tap to attack. Many of our opponent's creatures, however, if they choose to attack, will not untap during their next untap step, unless of course they just don't need their lands that turn, which, if you don't need your lands, you're doing something wrong probably. Now keep in mind though that we won't want to tap too many of our creatures for mana with Esika's ability when we have Storage Matrix on the battlefield, since those creatures will be hard to untap, so you'll need to be a bit strategic about playing Storage Matrix. And as long as we're considering Storage Matrix, there's plenty of other cards that make it harder for everyone to untap creatures. A Smoke is an enchantment that costs double red, and it lets players only untap a single creature during each of their untap steps. There's Juntu Stakes. This is an artifact that prevents creatures with power of 1 from untapping during the untap step. A Meekstone is another artifact that prevents creatures with power 3 or more from untapping. There's Crackdown, a white enchantment that prevents non-white creatures with power 3 or greater from untapping during their controller's untap step. But there's a few other of these types of cards as well. Now combined with these sort of stacksy effects, we can also use cards that cause our opponent's creatures to enter the battlefield tapped. Blind Obedience, Authority of the Consuls are perhaps the most efficient ways to do this. Of course we'll want Thalia, Heretic Cathar, since she's a legendary creature and she does the same. She's a 3/2 with first strike, she costs 3. And causes creatures and non-basic lands your opponents control to enter the battlefield tapped. Urabrask the Hidden is another legendary creature that causes your opponent's creatures to enter the battlefield tapped, and it also gives your creatures haste. But look, we don't have space for all of these cards. The Vigilance Matters theme is cool, but there's too many important things we need to focus on, like legendary matters and actually winning the game. And further, if we go too heavily into the Vigilance Matters theme, then our whole strategy gets turned off as soon as Esika is off the board. And I'd rather not introduce that type of vulnerability into our game plan. So I've tried to focus on implementing these Vigilance Matters cards only when they fit the theme of the rest of the deck. Some of the particularly useful inclusions are Derevi, Imperial Tactician, and Ojutai, Soul of Winter. Derevi lets you tap or untap any target permanent when Derevi enters the battlefield, or when a creature you control deals combat damage to a player. Ojutai, Soul of Winter is a legendary dragon that lets you tap a permanent an opponent controls whenever a dragon you control attacks, and that permanent doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Finally, there's several cards that can tap down your opponent's creatures. I've chosen to use Naya Charm in this deck, since it can also be used for graveyard recursion when we need that. And then we've also selected some legendary creatures that can untap our other creatures. We've already mentioned Derevi, who can tap or untap things. There's also Tyrannica, a Crowan veteran, who can untap a creature you control when she attacks. There's Samet, Voice of Dissent, who can also pay a white and tap herself to untap another creature. Both of these creatures also have Vigilance, which will help us out when we want to use these sort of stacksy effects to keep our opponent's creatures tapped down, but when we don't have Esika on the battlefield to give all of our creatures Vigilance. We've got 9 creatures with Vigilance in this deck, and a few more that can help us untap our creatures to minimize, again, the effects of these stacksy pieces on ourselves. But we've still got some more cool and miscellaneous synergies in this deck. Let's talk about those next before we move on to our win conditions. Let's start by talking about some of our mana ramp and mana fixing. We're playing a 5-color deck, and we're utilizing all 5 colors somewhat uniformly. Our deck has 34 cards that include white in the casting cost, 24 cards with green, 20 cards with blue, 14 cards with red, and 12 cards with black. Our commander lets all of our legendary creatures tap for mana of any color, so this both ramps and fixes us. But our commander also has double green pips in its casting cost, so we want to make absolutely certain that we have access to at least 2 green mana on turn 3. So outside of Esika's ability, I'm focusing more on mana fixing than mana ramp. We'll use Renegade Map, Traveler's Amulet, Wanderer's Twig. These are all artifacts that cost 1 and can be sacrificed to search our library for a basic land, put it into our hand. We have 23 basic lands in this deck. 8 forests, 6 plains, 5 islands, and 2 each of swamps and mountains. So these cheap artifacts are going to help us make sure that we have access to at least those 2 green mana on turn 3. We'll also get a lot of value from cards like Vitalize and Mobilize. These are 1 mana spells that untap all creatures we control. So this can help us generate extra mana when Esika's on the battlefield and turning all of our creatures into mana dorks. In the case of Vitalize, which is an instant, we can also untap our creatures in response to an attack to generate some surprise blockers. If our creatures were already tapped in the first place, that is. Now, Kinnan Bonder Prodigy is an obvious powerhouse in this deck. This is a 2-mana legendary creature. It says whenever you tap a non-land permanent for mana, add 1 mana of any type that permanent produced. So with Esika and Kinnan on the battlefield, all of our legendary creatures can now tap for 2 mana. Finally, I want to mention Lithoform Blight. This is a 2-mana aura that enchants a land. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and the enchanted land loses all land types and can tap for colorless, or its controller can pay 1 life and tap it to add 1 mana of any color. So again, Lithoform Blight is not ramp, but it is fixing. And it's awesome in this deck because we really want that mana fixing, and if we don't need it, we can also enchant our opponent's troublesome lands to effectively nullify them. Now, I want to go over some of the other creatures in this deck that are just cool legendaries that'll help us out a lot. First, we have some added protection for our board state with Linvala Shield of Seagate, a Gerard Weatherlight Hero, and Shalai Voice of Plenty. Linvala is a 3/3 flying angel that costs 1 white blue. It gives us some bonuses if we ever have a full party. That's 1 each of a cleric, rogue, warrior, and wizard, and we won't, so we can ignore this. But we can also sacrifice Linvala to give all of our creatures either hexproof or indestructible until end of turn. There's Gerard Weatherlight Hero. This is a 3/3 with first strike that costs 2 red-white. When Gerard dies, you exile it and return to the battlefield all artifact and creature cards in your graveyard that were put there from the battlefield this turn. So just like Linvala, Gerard will protect our board state by deterring our opponents from using board wipes or just nullifying them if they do. Shalai is pretty straightforward. This is a 3/4 flying angel. It costs 3 and a white. It gives all other creatures and planeswalkers we control hexproof. Note that it doesn't give itself hexproof. Shalai is also a mana sink. We can pay 4 green to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control. Finally, I want to mention a couple of really cool but somewhat obvious new lands from Kaldheim that we'll be running. Tyrite Sanctum can tap for colorless, or you can pay 2 and tap it to turn a legendary creature you control into a god permanently and put a +1/+1 counter on it. You can also pay 4 and tap and sacrifice it to put an indestructible counter on target god. So being able to pay 2 or more essentially 3 to put a +1/+1 counter on any of our legendary creatures is fine, and we can essentially pay 5 and sacrifice Tyrite Sanctum to protect one of our creatures too. Of course, we'll also play the World Tree. This is basically Chromatic Lantern on a land, and that's all the reason we need to play it. We can also pay double Wooburg and sacrifice the World Tree to pull all gods out of our deck and put them into play, but we probably won't do that. We aren't running very many gods in this deck. So we've got a lot of value in our legendary tribal deck. We have our recursion, we have our protection, we have our ramp, we have our mana fixing. But how do we finish games? Let's go over our win conditions. So we've got lots of legendary synergies. Thanks to Esika, we've got lots of mana of whatever color we want. So how do we actually win? Blackblade Reforged is an equipment that can turn any of our creatures into an existential threat in combat. It gives the equipped creature +1/+1 for each land you control, and it costs 7 to equip, but that cost drops to just 3 if you equip it to a legendary creature. Again, everything in our deck is legendary. Every creature anyways. Hero's Podium also supercharges our combat potential. This artifact costs 5, and it gives each legendary creature we control +1/+1 for each other legendary creature we control. So for example, if we have 5 legendary creatures, they all get +4/+4. It also gives us card advantage. We can pay X and tap it to look at the top X cards of our library, then we reveal a legendary creature from among them, put it into our hand. As long as Esika and her crew are generating lots of mana of whatever color we want, Kenrith the Returned King will generate stupid amounts of value to help us win the game. He's an awesome combat enabler. We can just pay 1 mana to give all of our creatures trample and haste, and just 2 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. Kenrith can draw you cards, gain life, recur creatures from your graveyard, and he doesn't tap to do any of this, so you'll quickly gain insurmountable advantage if he isn't removed quickly. But perhaps the most immediately threatening legendary creature in our deck is Najeela the Blade Blossom. She's a 3/2 warrior that costs 2 red. She lets players create a 1/1 attacking warrior creature token whenever they attack with a warrior, but we don't care about that. Most importantly, Najeela lets us pay WUBRG to untap all attacking creatures, give them trample, lifelink, and haste until end of turn, and then we get another combat phase. So Najeela plus Esika and 3 other legendary creatures will generally give us infinite combat steps, as long as we can attack without our creatures dying. Because Esika gives our legendary creatures vigilance, all we need to do is tap 5 of them after they attack to pay Najeela's ability. They'll untap and get to attack again, and repeat. Najeela can do this immediately on the turn that she enters the battlefield. Drop her onto your board when you've got at least 5 other legends that are ready to attack, and you can win on the spot. Of course, if you dislike subtlety, you can just play Door to Nothingness. This 5 mana artifact enters the battlefield tapped, and you can pay double WUBRG and tap and sacrifice it to have target player lose the game. Now this is great fun, but you will be playing Archenemy as soon as you cast this, so just be ready for that. Finally, we mentioned Sisay Weatherlight Captain earlier. All of these win conditions are legendary, well, except for Door to Nothingness, so Sisay can help us find them. And that is our Esika Legendary Matters deck. Let's go over the deck stats and cost. At the time of this recording, our legendary Esika tribal deck is coming in at $169.75 on tcgplayer.com. Our average CMC is 3.16. We are playing 37 lands and 29 creatures. And of those 29 creatures, every single one is legendary. We also have 11 sources of card draw and 8 sources that either fix or ramp our mana, in addition to our commander, of course. We have 7 pieces of single target removal, 1 piece of player removal, and 3 board wipes, plus several ways to tap down our opponent's creatures that I'm not including among these. Alright, so that is the Legendaries Matter deck built around Esika, God of the Tree. I like to build decks that have at least 2 different ways to play and win, even if one way happens to be dominant and the other is, kind of an alternative win condition. And that way you'll always have some backup options in case you lose an important combo piece, or you're just facing a matchup that invalidates one of your strategies. Now this Esika deck focuses on generating value from legendary synergies, finding one of a few pieces to push your advantage over the top and overwhelm your opponents, like Kenrith or Najeela, but you can also find pieces that tap down your opponent's creatures, and other pieces that keep them tapped down, so you might be able to grind out sort of a mini Staxy sort of win too. But that's all I have for today. Please like this video or subscribe if you found any of this useful. I make commander-focused content showing you all sorts of unconventional ways that you can build your commander decks, from budget alternatives to deck techs to top 10 lists. And thank you for watching.